Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. I am Jennifer Mitchell. I am Vice Chair of the New York City Employment Training Coalition Board, and I am also the Executive Director of the HOPE Program and Sustainable South Bronx. And I am thrilled to be here with everybody today. I am so excited about the energy in the room and in the workshops and in the space, and really proud of what we as a workforce development community are accomplishing, have accomplished, and what the future holds. I think it's really bright given the thoughts and the and just all the feedback and everything we're getting today. The future is bright, and as I think Phil Weinberg said earlier, this is a moment that we don't want to lose. So, in keeping with what Joey started off earlier today, I advocate to empower New Yorkers to build sustainable futures through comprehensive training, jobs, advancement, and lifelong career support. So, hopefully all of you are thinking about what you advocate for and will tweet it or say it at some point during the day today. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome our next conversation to the stage. Kathy Wylde, the President and CEO of the Partnership for New York City, is having a conversation with Jarrett Murphy, the Executive Editor of City Limits. So please join me in giving them a great big round of applause. Kathy and Jarrett. Enjoy the panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good? Good. Can you hear me? Checking my voice? No?
There's an on button.
That's why we have Kathy here to tell me how to turn this on. Hi, everybody. My name is Jarrett. I'm the editor of City Limits. And in my not so illustrious 20 years as a journalist, I've interviewed people from disgraced Senator Bob Packwood to Public Enemy frontman Chuck D. I actually called him Mr. D. But of all the folks I've had a chance to talk to, one of my favorites is sitting next to me, Kathy Wylde, because she's very smart and actually has that rare quality of being unpredictable sometimes. So maybe she'll be unpredictable today, though I don't want to oversell it. We know that the conference that's going on has a lot of excellent panels kind of digging deep in the details of workforce development and changes in the field, innovations in technology. So we thought we'd take these few moments to kind of pull back a little bit and set the conversation in a broader historical and economic and political framework. So let's start with that, Kathy. Pull us back. You've been monitoring this conversation for a long time. How has the discussion of workforce development in New York City changed over the years, do you feel?
Well, I think that workforce development is kind of a function of unions, employers, proprietary trade schools, and only for the last 30, 40 years have the not-for-profit sector, the intermediaries in the not-for-profit sector really been important. The programs, when I started in the 60s, were the CETA program, the Neighborhood Youth Corps. It was all federally driven programs. Then in the 90s, the Welfare to Work programs. And over that time, I think that gradually we developed through the community development movement, you developed a sense of the need for locally based workforce development groups and getting citywide intermediaries to bridge those gaps. Unfortunately, once the federal funding basically was pulled away and the funding became unpredictable, episodic, no big federal programs driving the work, it really left a patchwork of efforts that are the burden that the not-for-profit community has to absorb, which is often the case in many areas, including workforce development. But we used to have the federal government driving it, whether it was through reimbursement to proprietary schools or tax credits for employers or direct funding programs like CETA. Today, it is, as I say, putting together a patchwork between philanthropic and a variety of public, state, and local sources, allocation of federal funds that have diminished. So I can't say that the system is more robust. I think, if anything, less so.
How about effectiveness? The approaches that came out of the war on poverty in the 70s of CETA and the Job Corps, did they get the job done? Were they effective, do you think?
They were more WPA kind of mentality programs, but it did give people work experience and at scale. And so I do think that it developed, that they served a purpose at the time. That purpose, that has changed so completely because today, today, just work experience in any workplace or for a not-for-profit organization doing community projects has some value, but it certainly doesn't prepare you for the skilled work market labor market that has developed. And where we're falling short today is the fact that you can't really execute on a workforce development program that's going to get people into a decent paying job and where jobs are growing unless you have an educational and or highly technical component.
And talk about that, the role of technology in the workplace and the changing requirements for what makes someone an able worker, especially in New York City, where some of the sectors that we've seen explode in recent years are precisely technology and biotechnology, other industries that kind of circle around that. How has that changed sort of the basic equation of what workforce development means?
Well, every company is a tech company, and it basically means that workforce development is not vocational education. It's got to be fully integrated with an academic setting, and it's not just secondary education, but it's higher education. And we've never done a good job of bringing those pieces together. And I think we're beginning to see that happen. That's certainly been the effort of the last couple of years. The Department of Education and some of the workforce development groups have been helping. For example, we worked with the Department of Education and City Hall to set up a program called Industry Scholars, which is to make sure that students in career and technical education in secondary school get access to work experience over the summer. It's a greatly enriched summer youth employment experience. And that we really hadn't done something that integrated what the Department of Youth Community Development was doing on summer youth employment, where there were very few private sector employers involved, with preparing people for a job in a skilled sector of the economy. So these are little efforts, involve a couple thousand kids that are just getting started. We have to learn how to scale that. Because it's no longer realistic to think that a kid with a high school degree or an adult with no degree is going to get a living wage job. It's not going to happen.
A lot of the conversations that we've talked about and have been generally in the air over recent years, things like income inequality, race, inclusion, does workforce development tie into those issues, do you think, in a meaningful way in the city?
I don't think in a traditional sense, the CETA got people prepared and into civil service, government jobs mostly. Clearly, a lot went on with the healthcare industry that the union sponsored to get people trained for the healthcare industry. Both of those have been entree into the middle class positions for large numbers of minority populations in the city. So in that sense, yes, today, workforce development by itself, unless it's got the broader implication of being part of a larger skills development educational effort, it can't just be socialization skills and job placement. It's really got to be development of the ability to perform in a much more technical workplace. I think to the extent you can do that, yes, it can make a big difference, but we haven't learned how to scale that kind of program yet.
So you sit at the nexus of policy and business, well, you sit at a lot of nexuses, but policy and business. And so I wonder, how do the business people you interact with, how do they think about workforce development? Do they think about it in a systemic way, or is it just about kind of their next hire or their next round of hires? How do they approach this? What's important to them?
Well, I think there's going to be after us a good panel with, I was just talking to some of the members of it back in the green room or whatever that was. The business community does not think about workforce development. They define the credentials they need, and then they look for people that either are or can develop into those credentials. But increasingly, they see internal education and development of people. They don't look outside for workforce development so much as what they're going to do to create a talent, competing for a talent pool that they need is very hard. So once you get somebody into a company, and I think this is a good lesson for the workforce development people, if you can get somebody into a company, that company will probably take, in an entry-level job, they will provide them with the wherewithal in this day and age to move up. The problem is for all the people that can't get in the first place. And so, once they're in, the employer takes over.
And is that partly because technology is changing so rapidly that companies know they're going to need to tool to whatever is necessary at the moment?
It's the speed of change and the fact that the workplace, so within the next couple of years, we're going to need in this country 400,000 expert cybersecurity technicians or cyber technicians that we don't have today. And 4 years is not enough to train those people. Our immigration policies are not allowing us to import them at that scale. So what are we going to do about that problem? And employers have basically decided we're going to have to do it ourselves. We're working with, right now, a security company, bonding company, K2, which is a startup, and MasterCard are partnering, and they just opened a cyber 9 to 14 high school in the Bronx. And the graduates of that school with an associate degree will be entry-level employees that then, I think after that, the employer will take over either through tuition assistance to pursue their higher education on a part-time basis or whatever. But I think it's those kind of initiatives have to start early. And the unfortunate part of this, and I know what the members of the workforce development intermediary community deal with every day, is that you're like writing off a generation, because unless you're in high school, starting on a path at an early age toward math and science and technology, if you're 40 and have none of that going for you, what's the remedy? And that's where I think we miss the role that the federal government played historically to try and make sure that there was a safety net for that population of support, GEDs, the other kind of support services that workforce development groups, I know you all offer, but not at a scale that's required to deal with this gap.
You mentioned in that last answer the word importing, and I wanted to ask about that. For a lot of employers in New York City, the thinking is that if they can't find the talent they need here, they can bring, everyone wants to move to New York City, whether you're from somewhere else in the US or internationally. So what is the kind of cost-benefit analysis for an employer of trying to play some role in developing local talent versus just bringing what they need in from the outside?
Well, in point of fact, not everyone wants to move to New York City, and particularly in entry-level technical jobs. If you recently saw, we've got a major headquartered New York financial institution that's moving its headquarters to Nashville, Tennessee. And their analysis, and the analysis that their consultants gave them, was that there are a lot more trained graduates of community college, of college with technology and other degrees from Atlanta, from Michigan, from Illinois, who would like to go to Nashville, where they can lead a middle-class life on a relatively, what we would consider in New York, an entry-level salary, who can't do that here. And so there's a real pull for a lot of the jobs, and this is going to be another challenge for the workforce development groups as they're looking for placements and opportunities in New York. You will have to skip to the jobs that are going to be available here are going to be increasingly higher level jobs. Very nice because they're good salaries and pay lots of taxes, but not very good as a feeder for workforce development programs.
We hear a lot about the gig economy in New York and many other cities, and I don't know how big a piece of the employment picture that actually is, but what's the intersection between that trend of sort of an erosion of traditional employment and workforce development. As young people are developing, or people coming out of prison are redeveloping for the workforce, they might be thinking about a job, or they might be thinking about a lot of different jobs.
Well, the gig economy is based on the fact that you're going to have a lot of different jobs. And you might have a salaried job and then you have a gig on the side, like the folks that develop artifacts for Etsy, to sell on Etsy. I mean, we are figuring out ways that people can close their budget gap, but it's certainly not a solution to the larger problem this country faces. I don't think that's going to come until there's a major federal commitment to try and bring the skills of more people into line, and that's going to take into line with what the labor market is demanding. It's going to take a huge investment. I mean, they talk about the need for a $3 trillion infrastructure fund. Well, I don't think this is a whole lot less. But importantly, the point I was trying to make before, that I think that people, and I'm hoping today, I haven't looked at the whole program, but I saw you've got some higher education institutions on here. The integration between workforce development and education, changing the notion that vocational education is not a dumbing down of academic standards, because there's a lot of antagonism of the academic world against vocational education. The need today in this country is for vocational education, preparing people for real jobs. And what is the role of the workforce development intermediary in that? I would say that their ability to understand employers from a job placement standpoint, and most workforce development groups are pretty good at that, using that to try and help bring along the education community, both public schools and higher education, to understand how to prepare people to work for employers, how to build those relationships, how to connect people. We looked at the city's career and technical education program, for example, in the public schools a few years ago. There were 140,000 high school students in career and technical education, schools or employment, of which there were, this is 3 years ago, 1,300 had real work experience opportunities through internships. They had 300 employers in the private sector were all that were participating in all the public education programs. Most of them were nonprofit or public agencies that they were getting their work experience with. So you think we've got 200,000 businesses, employers in the city, and 300 were participating in the city's career and technical education program. It's totally screwed up. The intermediaries in workforce development have the capacity to build these bridges, but there's no system that connects them, that gives them the resources they need, that provides the technology, the platform on which you can communicate with opportunities and build and scale these efforts. So you've got all these anecdotal relationships and efforts, some of which are terrific models, but we haven't scaled them.
So that brings us to the question of the city's role, especially in recent years, at trying to shape that system. Mayor de Blasio talked about this, I think, in his first year in office. How do you evaluate their success or lack thereof so far?
They started out with enthusiasm and created some new initiatives. They worked with many of the foundations, the workforce funding groups, and developing a plan that made sense and looking at a new model. But unfortunately, the funding of workforce development is not only small, but it's basically driven federal, flows to state, flows to city. So you really have to put together all those pieces and amend federal law. A little bit was done to provide a little more flexibility, but not much more money. So I think there was frustration with the city, whereas in the housing world, they had a public-private relationships, federal, state, and city funding flows that were pretty well established, and they could ratchet up the housing program, which was another of their priorities. I think workforce development starting out was an equal priority for the de Blasio administration, but the pieces couldn't fall together to make it happen at scale. So I think they've had frustration. They set up an Office of Workforce Development, or David Fisher was just on the last panel, a Center for Youth Employment in City Hall. But again, the resources to scale that effort, which do require all levels of government to participate if you're going to get to scale, we're not there.
Today, the administration announced that Amy Peterson, who has overseen for a few years the city's rebuilding effort from Sandy, is the new head of the Office of Workforce Development. What do you think about that appointment?
I like her. I don't know. What do you want me
Well,
to
that's
say?
good. Better than the opposite.
I wish her luck, but it's been something of a revolving door. And so the question is, will she have the support she needs to get something done? And I think that's, honestly, the big resources in this city and state are in the education area, both higher education and secondary education. We have the highest per capita spend in education, $25,000 per pupil per year of any state in the country. I think workforce development has to be incorporated as part of our education system at both the secondary and higher education level, even before secondary. If it got the attention that universal pre-K got, we'd be in a whole different spot today. So I think that the key to this is figuring out how to overcome the sort of silos, particularly the silos, the silo that workforce development has been in, where you're sort of out there helping people learn to prepare resumes, and understand that that you really do understand, for the most part, the groups that I've met and worked with over the years have a very good sense of workplace needs, even if they're rapidly changing, and how to meet them, but they don't have the resources or the collaborative relationships with educational institutions to plug in. So we've remained, even today, with all that we know, overly dependent on proprietary trade school kind of credentialing and funding, which is better than the workforce development groups get from the government, to be able to solve these problems. And so I think it's a marriage, and I do think now the leadership at the Department of Education and at City Hall understand that, and that they are working hard to get the education community to understand that workforce development is not just the old voc ed, but that in fact it is critical to anybody getting a good job in the future economy.
So we have only a couple minutes left. I'm curious, you alluded earlier to a couple of...
Why don't you answer a question?
Oh, no. They pay me more for that. You've alluded to a couple things kind of coming down the pipe for the city, the need for cybersecurity people as an opportunity, I guess, the challenge of competing against other smaller cities that are just more affordable. What other big challenges or opportunities for this sector, this conversation, do you see that we'll be talking about in 10 to 15 years?
Well, hopefully, we're not talking about 10 or 15 years. There is a need to be able to deal with a whole series of populations. There's the ex-offender population, particularly as we reduce the population in Rikers. The best job has probably been done in terms of the partnership with employers with veterans. Those numbers are pretty robust at this point. But otherwise, in terms of everybody else, I think that there's a recognition, going back to your question earlier that I didn't really answer directly. Most employers, most members of the business community feel like the only way to bridge income inequality is through preparing people with the skills they need to have a living wage job, a decent job. And so I think politically the pressures are more and more going to push toward support for a workforce development education program built into our public system, and that I believe the business community will make that a top priority item, if not the top priority item going forward, particularly as there's more and more pressure for equal opportunity and equity in this country. I think the only positive solution that business can get behind is let's invest in workforce.
So final question, measuring success, how will we know in 10 or 15 years that we have moved the needle in a positive direction on this? It's not just the unemployment rate, it's a question of quality of jobs. What will we be able to look at and say, you know what, we did better than we thought, or we still have a long way to go?
Well, a couple years ago, we worked with the legislature and CUNY and in the city and others to establish the right to do a wage reporting system where you can get actual data on what kind of jobs people are getting and retaining at what salary after they graduate from various programs in school, both educational, workforce development. I think we have to see numbers, and if be honest about the numbers we're seeing today, the number of people who have fallen out of the extent to which we have a very low labor participation rate, how that changes. I mean, London is like 10 points higher than we are, which I find, they're supposed to be more socialist than us, and here we are. So I think that we have to have numbers, and we have to have a system that tracks people, that shows the real performance results, the placements and retention, but that shouldn't be the obligation of the nonprofit groups and their contracts that are trying to get jobs, because that just will keep, as long as they're not funded, this is going to be a very small number. It may grow, but it's going to be very small. That's a crazy way to do it. We've got to do it where the whole society is responsible for those numbers.
Well, Kathy Wylde, you are much more knowledgeable about this than Chuck D would have been, so I appreciate it.
Is that a compliment?
A round of applause, please. Thank you.